I've had some inquiries from the congregation about what's going on in the larger United Methodist Church, and specifically what this process known as disaffiliation that some churches are going through is about. And whenever I ask other people who are much more heavily involved in the larger United Methodist Church about this, what they say to me is, what you want is a crystal ball. Because in order to determine that, we need to know what's going to happen next spring when the General Conference convenes in Charlotte, North Carolina. I do have information about the church and about things that have preceded this to go forward. On the front of your bulletin, you will notice we now have a new web page. That is a web page for the United Methodist News Service. That is the best place to go for up-to-date information about what's happening in the denomination. What is happening in the United Methodist Church has made the secular news media. We are the second largest Protestant denomination in the country, and so this is a topic of interest. But the secular news media doesn't always appreciate the intricacies of what's going on in the denomination. That website will remain on the front of your bulletin into next year, and it's the best place for the latest and accurate information. I am also a seminary-trained United Methodist elder, ordained in the Virginia Conference. I have had conversations with Bishop Sue Harper Johnson, with District Superintendent Doug Forrester, with the Reverend Rob Vaughn, who combined with clergy and laity from around the world, have been involved in writing legislation for the next General Conference, and with other pastors in our conference and in other conferences, including some pastors whose churches have gone through the process of disaffiliation. I'm going to divide my remarks into 3 sections. The first will deal with our history as it relates to our structure. The second with the impact of the 2019 General Conference on what we're experiencing now. And third, what is before us at Northview Church. My first point will be the longest, my second point will be shorter than the first, and the third point will be shorter than the first 2. John Wesley is the founder of the Methodist movement. He was born in the early part of the 1700s and died towards the end of that century. He and his brother Charles, who wrote the lyrics to the hymn we began the service with today, were ordained in the Church of England. John Wesley was concerned that the church of his day was not reaching the general population. So he went out into the fields. He talked to people who were going to work in factories and coal mines. And he went into some of the poor communities throughout England. And the Methodist movement is something that had a profound impact on English society and culture through evangelism and through social reform. He and his brother remained ordained in the Church of England for their entire life. And Methodists were sent to the Church of England to receive the sacraments, such as communion and baptism. The movement in England became separated from what was going on in the colonies because of the American Revolution. Therefore, John Wesley took a bold step of appointing 2 men, Francis Asbury and Thomas Cook, to be bishops and having the authority to ordain elders to serve within the states. This was also going on in other denominations and traditions then too. Many American denominations had their start at that time period. This means that the Methodist movement began in England, but the Methodist Church began here. There was an organizing conference known as the Christmas Conference that occurred in 1784. And this set up the makeup for the denomination going forward. Polity is the term for church government. you'll notice the similarity between that and politics. Politics is how we govern civic society, and polity is how we govern ourselves in the church. So the Methodist Church was born at the same time as the United States government. Therefore, our polity is based on the United States government. In the United States, we have federal, state, and local authorities. In our denomination, we have Northview Church. It is a part of the Valley Ridge District. It is a part of the Virginia Conference. And it is a part of the Southeastern Jurisdiction. And it is represented by the General Conference that convenes every 4 years. The United States Constitution is the foundation for all laws in the United States of America. And what we refer to as the Book of Discipline is like our Constitution. That's a rather ominous title. It makes it sound like you spank people with this. But the root of the term discipline there goes back to a Latin term for habitual behavior. So someone who is in extremely good shape, who has a regular exercise regimen, feels out of place or misses it whenever the exercise regimen lags. That's the same idea as we condition ourselves to be stronger in the faith. In the United States, we have a Congress that proposes and passes legislation, a president that signs that into law, and a Supreme Court that interprets the law. In our denomination, we have a General Conference that convenes every 4 years. We also have a Council of Bishops, which meets every 4 years. Next year is the regularly scheduled year for General Conference. 2 years after that, the Council of Bishops will meet. So that means every 2 years, there is some body that convenes that represents the denomination worldwide. And we have the Judicial Council. They are the ones who interpret church law the same way the Supreme Court does in our country. The Book of Discipline begins with our history and the history of the different denominations that have merged to make the United Methodist Church. It also has the list of all of our bishops, starting back in 1784 and going all the way through now to those who currently serve. It is followed by what's known as the Articles of Religion. This is something that we hold in common with Christians worldwide. There are 2 sets of articles because our denomination is a merger of 2 denominations, the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church. Both articles of religion are found there. And there is a clause at the end of the articles that states no legislative body ever has the authority to remove or to edit anything within the articles. The articles include the kind of things that we affirm in the Apostles' Creed every Sunday. That's something that we hold in common with all Christians. Following that is a section that's known as the Social Principles. This is a commentary on a number of contemporary issues. When I went into seminary in 1993, I was taught that the social principles are written for the denomination. It is an informed opinion about a variety of topics that has been voted on and approved by the General Conference. If your Sunday school group, if your United Women in Faith, or your small group is talking about a contemporary issue, you can find the church's statement on that in here or in the Book of Resolutions, which is a supplement to that. It's a way of bringing the entire denomination into your Sunday school room when you have particular conversations. That's about the first 30% of this book. The other 70% is a legal document. Property trust clauses, the number of people who can be on a committee, the minimum and maximum number, the process towards ordination, the education prescribed for ordination. That's the kind of thing that can be found in the rest of the book. And most of the book, except for the Articles of Religion, can be amended at the General Conference. when they meet every 4 years. Delegates to General Conference are elected by annual conferences. Annual Conference and General Conference have 50-50 lay clergy representation. You have a lay delegate who goes every year to the Virginia Conference. And in an election year, that person is responsible for electing delegates to represent the larger conference at General Conference when the Worldwide Methodists convene. During my 6 years with you, Linda Farrell, Keith Moore, and Helen Watson have been your annual conference delegates. They are the ones who voted to approve the people that went to General Conference. Any changes ever made to this book were made by people voted on by those that you know. The General Conference, the Judicial Council, as I said, is a body of representative clergy and laity that interpret the constitutionality of everything in the Book of Discipline when there is a question about it. As Keith mentioned, we began the annual conference with an old tradition of singing Charles Wesley's hymn, "And Are We Yet Alive?" This is something that was done at the very first annual conference back in 1784, and it references that division and mergers are all a part of the history of Christian traditions, and we continually seek God's guidance. By tradition, this hymn has been sung at the beginning of every annual conference since 1784. This year, I was pleased to hear that Drew, who led our music, had a very jazzed up version of this hymn that really had people on their feet. Now, throughout the history of our denomination and all Christian denominations, there are times that our country and our culture have influenced what's going on in the denomination. And there are times that what's going on in our church influences what's happening in the country too. In order to have a good understanding of this, let's take the example of how our denomination has dealt with the topic of race. At the first General Conference, whenever the Methodist denomination was founded, it was known as the Methodist Episcopal Church. Just prior to the Civil War, the denomination split into the Methodist Episcopal Church North and the Methodist Episcopal Church South. This was also going on in other American Christian denominations at that time period too. What happened in the church reflected what was going to happen in the nation. Several generations later, when there was no one left alive who remembered that first time, the denomination then chose to merge the northern and southern churches. This happened at a general conference in 1948. And at that time, one of the areas of debate had to do with the role of race within the denomination. Within the South, segregation was the law of the land. And as a son of the South myself, my relatives are quick to point out, even though it was the law here, it was also practiced in other parts of the country. So the denomination dealt with this in two ways. First, they established jurisdictions. Jurisdictions would divide up the country. We are a part of the southeastern jurisdiction. The entire denomination has representatives get together every 4 years at General Conference. Also at that time, the jurisdictional conference meets within a particular region. That's a way of saying that the bishops who will oversee your conference come from your area. You're not likely to get somebody from the Pacific Northwest coming down to Virginia. Theoretically, it is possible, but it normally doesn't occur. Another thing that is done was what was known as the central jurisdiction was established. This was a collection of all the African American churches in the United States of America. There were African American congregations with African American pastors and bishops and district superintendents that oversaw them. This was not geographically located, but it just represented all of the African American churches. So when the Methodist Church was formed in 1948, it was a segregated denomination. In 1968, at General Conference, the Methodist Church merged with the Evangelical United Brethren. This is another Wesleyan tradition that goes back to the time of our nation's founding, but originally it spoke to German-speaking Wesleyans. By the early 20th century, they were no longer publishing any German hymnals, and hardly anybody in that denomination spoke German. So the two denominations merged at that time. The American Civil Rights Movement was influencing what was going on in the church. And the Assembly in 1968 knew that when these two denominations merged, they had to do so as a racially integrated church. So all of those within the central jurisdiction became United Methodist churches, along with the churches of the other two denominations, and all of their bishops became integrated into the life of the church. Now, initially in practice, many churches tended to just favor one demographic or the other, but today cross-racial appointments are very common in the church. So a congregation that might be predominantly white will have a Filipino or a Korean or a Mexican or African American pastor. It's one of the ways that we celebrate our diversity. Now, in the same way that what was going on with race influenced both the church and the country, a similar thing happened with the gay rights movement. That became a conversation in the 1970s at General Conference. And by the end of that decade, our position on that in the denomination was fixed, and it has remained the same since then. And it states that homosexual persons are people of sacred worth who are created by God. It also, though, does not allow the ordination of homosexuals, and it does not recognize gay marriage. It also includes in the social principles a statement that has been very inflammatory, that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teachings. There are two things in the social principles referred to in that way. The other one is war. The debate continued within the general church, and fuel was added to the fire in the middle of the 1990s. There were some pastors in our denomination who were refusing communion or refusing to receive as membership anyone who was recognized as gay or lesbian. The Judicial Council of our denomination voted that pastors were allowed to do that based on the language in the social principles. We were not required to, but pastors had the freedom to do that. I myself and many of my colleagues find that kind of practice to be repugnant, but that is something that certain clergy were allowed to do at that time. That brings me to my second point, the General Conference of 2019. The debate over human sexuality intensified until finally the General Conference decided they needed to have a special called General Conference in a non-General Conference year, meaning an odd year, in order to deal with this one topic. That occurred in 2019. You may have recalled that I spoke about the General Conference during the Sunday school time and what was going on with the denomination at that point in time. The main piece of legislation going to General Conference that I talked about was voted down, and so those circumstances don't apply. You can still find that on our YouTube page. It's one of the most popular things in terms of viewership on our YouTube page. It does come behind, though, Linda teaching the children how to make bread, and I'm happy to play second fiddle to Linda there. Public opinion in the United States of America has changed regarding homosexuality, but not in other parts of the world. While the church declines here in the United States of America, it has grown in other parts of the world, such as throughout the African continent. These are countries where sodomy is illegal, where somebody who is found guilty of it can be jailed, And in several countries, it's been a capital offense. Someone could be killed if they were convicted of this. At the 2019 General Conference, what was known as the Traditionalist Plan was approved by a 52% majority. Those who were advocating in favor of this go by the title of traditionalists. You'll hear me use that term later. This is a very small majority given the number of people who were there. It's only a majority of 50 votes from the Methodists from around the world. It kept the prohibitions against ordaining homosexuals, and it kept the prohibition against gay marriage. And the penalties for any clergy person who officiated at a gay marriage or a board of ordained ministry that ordained someone who was homosexual was increased. A year-long suspension without pay was the initial response whenever that happened. So our language remained, but the penalties were increased because of that. Now, at that General Conference, there was also a proposal that allowed for churches to leave the denomination. If they did this, there were certain things that they had to do. They had to pay apportionments, the current and a previous year. They had to pay a certain amount of money to fund pensions for retired clergy. And they also needed to be voted on by a special conference of the annual conference. That is what happened at the 2019 conference. Now, here in Virginia, the way this is addressed is that quarterly conferences are held online. Keith, your lay delegate, and I attend that. And the churches that have gone through the process to disaffiliate are presented and are voted upon. It is not something that we did as a part of our general business in Roanoke 2 weeks ago. Now, the odd thing that is occurring is that at the 2019 General Conference, the traditional plan with the prohibitions against gay clergy and gay marriage were upheld, and the penalties against violating that were strengthened. Logic would suggest that this proposal for churches to leave the denomination was put in for people who are more progressive, for churches that might want to leave the denomination and join the United Church of Christ or other denominations like that. But what's happening in large numbers, the vast majority of people who are choosing this option are people who agree with the traditionalist plan. The people who passed the legislation, who wrote the legislation, and got everything they want are the same people who are now leaving the denomination, claiming that they are incompatible with the rest of the denomination. So, why are traditionalists leaving in such large numbers? Well, I need to mention two things before going any further. Those of you who have been with me throughout my 6 years here know my feelings on this topic, but those of you who are newer to the congregation, I support removing the language regarding homosexuality from the Book of Discipline. I support the ordination of homosexuals and allowing for gay marriage. That's my personal feeling. I know not everybody agrees with me, including members of this congregation. I need all of you to know that I respect you and your right to make up your own mind, and I consider everyone who is a part of this church to be my partner in ministry and my brother and sister in Christ. Second thing I need to acknowledge is I do not respect the leadership of the traditionalist faction, so I'm stating my bias up front. For one thing, the traditionalist faction has a huge infrastructure that has been in the works since the 1980s. Traditionalists have these shadow organizations, agencies, and institutions for every organization and agency within the United Methodist Church. They have their own mission society. They have their own seminaries. They have their own publishing houses. There is a large infrastructure for 40 years that has been built and is in place, and that was anticipating the time when the denomination would split. Second, leaders of this group have been involved on a massive misinformation campaign. One of the things that they have claimed is that our denomination, the United Methodist Church, was going to change its theology and we would no longer believe in the Trinity. But as I've stated earlier, that is completely false. The Book of Discipline and the Articles of Religion has a clause going back to the 1700s that says for as long as the denomination exists, no one can remove our belief in the Trinity, the books we recognize as part of the Bible, what we acknowledge as the sacraments. Those are parts of our beliefs for all time. Bishop Sue asked the ordination candidates to offer answers to the historic questions in front of the entire annual conference. Keith mentioned the clergy session, which meets separately. At that clergy session, you have all active, full, and part-time clergy. Those who can vote on matters that come before are those who are ordained, and laity who are members of the conference board on ordination. They were asked the historic questions at that time, including, have you read and studied the Articles of Religion? Have you sought to understand them? Will you teach them in all of the ministry settings which you serve? This has been asked of everyone who has been ordained in our tradition since the 1700s. And Bishop Sue wanted them to do it again in front of the entire annual conference in order to address the misinformation. Also, now that the Global Methodist Church has founded, we can see what type of polity, what type of church government they favor. And when we look at that, we find they're making a number of other significant changes. One of the changes they have is changes in the educational requirements for ordination. I have a bachelor's and a master of divinity degree. That is the educational track for those who are ordained in our denomination. But the Global Methodist tradition has another academic track that is far less rigorous, that does not involve a college or seminary education, and is therefore far less expensive. They're also making changes in how clergy are appointed to churches. We have what's known as an appointment system. A bishop appoints clergy to serve in churches, and every year that appointment is either renewed or the pastor moves. But in the new Global Methodist Church, they will have a call system. Those of you who grew up in the Baptist church, it's much like what you experience there. Whenever there's a vacancy, there's a pulpit committee that meets, resumes are sent in from potential pastors, and some of them are brought in to preach, and the entire church votes to decide whether or not to have this person as a pastor. That's one of the changes, too, that's going on in the Global Methodist Church. They will also have term limits for bishops, and bishops will have much less authority and control than they do in the United Methodist Church. All of that is to say that human sexuality is really not the issue here. We can see as this new traditionalist denomination has formed that their actual agenda is completely reconfiguring a new denomination. The debate over human sexuality, which they recognize as volatile, simply became their means of creating something that stirred up people within the denomination enough. Human sexuality is just the door that the traditionalists are using to exit our denomination. That leads me to our final point. Questions have been asked of me as to why I have not been talking about what's going on in the denomination and disaffiliation. Two things. First, as you can see, it takes a lot of time. And my remarks today are actually half of what they were originally before I whittled them down. And secondly, I don't believe that what's going on in the denomination applies to or affects us at all at Northview. We are an active, vital part of the United Methodist connection, and I don't anticipate that that needs to change. There are only two areas regarding the current language with homosexuality that could potentially affect a church. One is ordination, but only the Board of Ordained Ministry for the conference can ordain somebody. I have never been on the Board of Ordained Ministry, and as far as I'm aware, there are no laity in this church who who have been on that conference board either. And the other has to do with marriage. Now, in general, it's important to know that laws and customs have changed the way we approach marriage in the church. What I mean by that is it is now very easy for somebody to become registered and become an officiant to officiate at a wedding. A couple can get an officiant, have a completely secular service or service that involves prayers or whatever they want. I've even known of pastors' children who got married, who invited their parents to the ceremony, but did not invite their parents to participate. Also, finances play heavily into whether or not people are getting married, particularly people of a certain age, where getting married rather than being in a relationship means giving up certain benefits. And we've got a younger generation that looks at the older generation, people my age and older, and our 50% divorce rate, and they're a little more cautious about going into marriage. I have been here for 6 years. I've only done 2 weddings in 6 years. They were both outside couples, and I did them at no charge to me or to the church in hopes that maybe they might come back. That hasn't worked out yet. In my last appointment, I was in that appointment for 5 years. I served 2 churches. I had 1 wedding in each church. One during the life of my time there, and the other on the Saturday before my last Sunday when I departed that church. And in the one before that, I served for 3 years, and I only had 1 wedding, and that was my father-in-law and his bride, who came down to be with us so that I could officiate at their wedding. Dina and I both stood there with them, and some volunteers from the church were there to take pictures. So in general, I'm not doing a lot of weddings, period. And also, according to the Book of Discipline, I am not obligated to do anybody's wedding. If I have misgivings about a couple, I have the right to refuse. That's why we don't marry drunk people. And as this topic relates to same-sex marriage, that's not something that's currently allowed. It's not something I'm able to do. But I do have testimony in that area, because I do have gay and lesbian friends who are married to their same-sex partners, who have said to me when they were planning to get married, when we talked about the service, Doug, we thought about asking you, but we knew if we did that, you would suffer serious penalties, and we would never put you through that. So I don't anticipate that that topic would ever come up because of the integrity and the compassion that I have experienced from my friends. If churches do want to disaffiliate, they've got until the 7th of July to contact the district superintendent to lead them through that discussion. The administrative council needs to meet and vote on whether or not they want to invite the DS to come in and have that conversation. I am not allowed to be at that meeting because as an ordained elder, my vows involve the promotion of the denomination and not the breaking of it. But that's the current situation. But I don't see Northview disaffiliated. Nobody has ever mentioned anything to me to suggest that that is something you would want to do, and that's not who you are. At annual conference this year, as Keith mentioned, we had 35 volunteers handling registration, and you did it better than it's ever been done before. And I strutted around annual conference as proud as a rooster, telling everybody I saw that when your credentials were handed to you, one of my members did that. In the display room that Keith had in his display behind you, you had representation of all the ministries of the Virginia Conference. In the same room where our volunteers were registering people and giving them their credentials, they had displays like this. They had kids' school, where volunteers from our church have served ministry, served meals, and taken school supplies to for many years. They had the United Women of Faith, formerly known as the United Methodist Women, that have been promoting missions worldwide for over a century now. And this church has had a United Women in Faith circle that has been very active in our district. We had Embrace Ministry of Waynesboro. They were our first quarterly mission offering. And Pastor Joe came here and talked about that. We had the Virginia Commission on Disabilities display. They are the people we got money from to do the ramps out front to make it easier for people to come up here. That's money that is ours free and clear, that we never have to pay to anyone else because we are remaining in the denomination. And you had the Virginia Tech Wesley Society who was there. At the end of the pandemic, when they started going back into local churches, they chose Northview as the first place for them to come and to lead the worship service that day. There were all of those many ministries that were there. And Northview, you had a hand in every one of those because you were a part of the United Methodist Connection. We benefit from being a part of that connection, and that connection benefits from having us as a part of it. And it is my privilege to serve with you in ministry every day.